What's up guys, welcome back to Pat Outdoors. We finally got the controller back for the Mantis X. Thank you Rawrr for helping me address this issue very quickly. Let's go put this thing back on and get this bike back on the road. If you happen to follow this channel, you might know that I accidentally disabled this bike by using Rawrr's app to attempt to update this controller, which essentially downloaded the tune for their larger Mantis, which disabled this bike completely since all the parameters are different. Luckily, it didn't completely break the controller. I was able to send it over to Rawrr for them to re-download the tune for the Mantis X, which should fix the issue. They are still making some updates to their app to make it fully compatible with the Mantis X and the Mantis Mini. I know a lot of people commented on my previous video. Rawrr has a banner on their website not to use the app with this bike for the meantime, but I already had the bike for a couple weeks at that time, so I didn't really have a reason to go back to their website periodically. So unfortunately, I just happened to miss that notification. I'm gonna start by plugging in the hall sensor connector since it's a little harder to reach than the other plugs once the controller is mounted on the frame. I'm actually going to take off this brace so we get better access to those two bolts. Now there's a lot more room for us to move the harness and bolts around. Okay, moment of truth. Oh, thank God. All right, looks like everything is back to normal. I also received a message from Sonia at Rawrr recommending that I check the torque specs on the rear suspension, as some of these bikes may have come from factory with it set a little bit too tight. So we're gonna loosen the hardware for the rear shock and retorque them down to 28 Newton meters. I'm also gonna be adding a little bit of grease on the inside portion of the bolt where it makes contact with the KKE shock, just to make sure that there is proper movement there and that the rear suspension is operating smoothly. So if you recently purchased a Rawrr Mantis X, make sure you check the torque specs on your rear suspension. To do this, you're gonna need a 3/8 torque wrench, a 13mm wrench. I'm just using a 3/8 wrench with a 15mm socket and extension, some multi-purpose grease, and some blue Loctite. Luckily, this Rawrr toolbox toolkit that came with the bike actually came with some Loctite. But if you are interested in checking out any of the tools, if you don't have them, I'll have them linked in the description below. You know what? The toolkit actually came with a 13mm, but the other side is the 15, so you are still gonna need the ratchet with a 15 and extension. Wow, that is pretty tight. Man, I wonder what that was torqued down to. We're gonna keep the nut just barely on there since we're gonna be sliding the bolt out to the left side of the bike. So I'm gonna release the tension by lifting the tail, sliding the bolts over. I'm actually gonna slide the bolts over a little bit more. going to be applying a little bit of grease on this portion of the bolt. No need to go crazy, just a very light coating. Now we're going to be adding a little bit of blue Loctite on the threaded portion of the bolts. And then we're going to resecure everything. Please ignore how dirty the bike is. I just took this bike out to some really flooded trails the other week, and I live in an apartment complex, so unfortunately I don't have like a power washing station, but we are gonna wash this bike after we take it out today. Now I'm gonna attach that 15 extension to this torque wrench, and we're gonna set it to 28 Newton meters. And if your torque wrench only reads in foot-pounds, I think that's a little over 20 foot-pounds. That's it. One last thing that Sonia recommended I check on my Mantis X is the chain slack. Since this bike does not have an intermediate shaft like Sur-Rons or Talarias, this is direct drive, so it requires a similar slack to gas dirt bikes. The recommended chain slack for the Mantis X is about 1 inch, which I'm pretty happy with where mine is currently adjusted. So we're not going to be making an adjustment. Just to show you guys an example, this is my old Yamaha TTR 230. And it's got plenty of slack on it. Actually, I think I need to tighten this. Just to show you an example of what I mean, on a Talaria, I have my chain tension adjusted a lot tighter on this bike, maybe about 1/2 inch, since it has a intermediate shaft. There's a belt that connects the shaft to the motor, and the chain tension doesn't actually tighten or loosen depending on how the swing arm compresses, since it rides right on the pivot point. On the Mantis X, however, it goes directly to the gearbox on the motor, which is a few inches in front of the pivot point. So the chain tension does change as the swing arm compresses. But if you do need to tighten or loosen your chain to make an adjustment, you would have to break this axle nut loose, and then you can slide the axle blocks back to tighten the chain or bring it back forward to loosen it. You would have to loosen these jam nuts, which I believe are 12 millimeter, and then you can make the adjustments with the 10 millimeter wrench. Just make sure that you're adjusting it evenly on both sides to make sure that your rear wheel is tracking perfectly straight. Man, I'm so glad to have this thing back on the road. Man, I still can't get over how much power, suspension, and braking this thing has. All for $3 grand. Like, that is such a bargain. I keep getting comments on my videos about comparing this to E-Ride Pro SS and how that's so much better, but that is a completely different class of bikes. It is $4,500. I'll tell you what, one thing that I noticed right away hopping back on this thing coming from my Talaria is it rides a lot smoother. It just absorbs speed bumps and potholes a lot more efficiently than my Triple X. Man, I miss riding this bike so much. I have been looking at upgrades for this thing while we had it waiting for a week and a half while the controller was out of it. And I was able to confirm that the stock battery output is 90 amps continuous. So with the battery BMS being perfectly matched with the 90 amp output of the factory controller, there might not be a point of upgrading the controller just yet, unless you're gonna upgrade the battery at the same time. I know Rawrr is offering a new 72 volt 35 amp hour battery pack for this thing that's supposed to slide right into place with no modifications, obviously. And I haven't been able to confirm the BMS specs on that, but I'm hoping that it has at least a 150 amp power output. That'll at least make it worth it for us to touch the controller and get more speed out of this thing. But who could really complain about 50 miles an hour for $3,000? Like, I don't really know of another e-moto at that price range that you're able to go that fast straight out of the box without any sort of modifications. The only other bike I can think of at this time is the Rawrr XXX, which I have. I freaking love that bike. For that bike, you just snip the brown wire and you're able to go 48 miles an hour straight from factory with a 60 volt battery. With this bike, there is no such thing as cutting a wire or manually de-restricting the controller. It is all in the programming, so you would have to swap out the controller if you want to get more power out of this thing. Unless you guys have alternative suggestions, comment below if you happen to know of an aftermarket battery that fits the Rawrr Mantis without modification that has a higher output than the factory one. But really, this bike is so much fun right out of the box. I wouldn't even do modifications to this bike until you get fully used to the stock power and riding to its limitations, which I'm currently not. I'm still learning how to ride this bike fully. I've been taking it on off-road trails here and there. Obviously, it is all caked in mud, but I want to continue doing some further testing on and off-road before I give out my full opinion on pros and cons list about this bike. Overall, I still think you cannot beat it for $3,000. I am still learning how to do wheelies. I'm still trying to get comfortable with the rear brake and timing and modulating it just to keep the front end up. One of my favorite things about this bike is this seat. I think it is very comfortable. I can definitely ride this all day in comparison to my Rawrr stock seat. I just like how wide it is and how long the surface area is. It is very similar to a regular dirt bike. I have been looking at upgrades available for this bike. We already know you can always swap out the handlebars for some different size risers. You can swap out the sprockets, whatnot. Do you guys happen to know if there are any Supermoto wheel sets that fit this thing directly? I kind of want to measure it out if this is the same exact width and dimensions as the Rawrr or a Sur-Ron, because that would definitely open up a huge variety of options on what we can do with this thing. If you guys enjoyed today's video or found it helpful in any way, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you like this kind of content, want to keep up with some of my projects such as this Rawrr Mantis X, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn your bell notification on. But this is going to be it for today. Thank you for watching.